welcome to this Green Alliance webinar. My name is Katarina Brandmeier, and I'm the Director of Policy and Translation at the Grantham Institute at Imperial College. And I'm delighted to be chairing this event, during which we'll be taking a closer look at what the UK government should be doing to build confidence in the greenhouse gas removal industry. Greenhouse gas removals are expected to play a vital role in tackling climate change. All pathways to limit global temperatures in line with the Paris Agreement, in fact, require not only rapid emissions reduction, but also removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, with the latest IPCC assessment describing carbon removals as unavoidable to reach net zero emissions and eventually net negative emissions in the longer term, and with estimates in the range of hundreds of billions of tons of carbon dioxide removal needed by the end of the century. Rapid scale-up is therefore essential, and for this reason, it's certainly welcome that businesses have shown growing interest in this area of climate action. However, it's fair to say there are also concerns around the way that the greenhouse gas removal sector may develop. In particular, these are concerns around whether businesses may be over-relying on carbon removal and they might therefore underinvest in climate mitigation as part of their net zero transition path. While on the other hand, the concerns around accuracy of some carbon removal claims and the poor track record of carbon offsetting schemes could undermine confidence in the sector. In today's event, which marks the launch of a new Green Alliance report on this subject, we'll be taking a closer look at these issues and discuss possible solutions to ensure effective governance for the scale-up of greenhouse gas removals. Joining me on this webinar are James Elliott, Senior Policy Advisor at Green Alliance and lead author of this report. We're also joined by Donna Rourke, Head of ESG and Sustainability at BNP Paribas Real Estate, and Steve Smith, who's Executive Director of Oxford Net Zero Initiative, as well as Executive Director of the UK's multidisciplinary research hub on greenhouse gas removals, known as CORE. In a minute, I'll be handing over to Jim, who will give a short presentation about the report findings and recommendations. We will then hear from Steve and Donna, who will provide some initial remarks in response to Jim's presentation, and we'll move on to then discuss some of the themes of the report. Importantly, there will also be some time to address questions from the audience, so please do use the Q&A function if there's anything that you'd like to ask the speakers. And there's also a chat function in case you'd like to react to what the speakers are saying or chat amongst yourselves, but please do use the Q&A function if you're planning to ask questions of the speakers. And now, without further ado, I will hand over to James for his presentation.
Thanks, Katarina, and welcome everybody. In January, you may have seen that the Guardian reported on an analysis that they'd carried out, which argued that 90% of rainforest carbon credits that were being sold under Vera's carbon standard were what they called phantom credits, kind of bogus greenwashing. They didn't represent real additional emissions reductions. 3 months before this, the BBC's Panorama released an episode in which they alleged that subsidised biomass burning at Drax Power Station was responsible for clear felling of old growth forests in Canada, and that this was having negative consequences for climate and biodiversity. Why do I bring up these stories? Well, they're just kind of two examples of many we could probably pick out that illustrate that the time really has come where the government needs to take a more proactive role in shaping how the carbon removal industry is going to grow. We do need to rapidly scale up our ability to remove carbon from the atmosphere and to store it if we're going to reach net zero, because there are going to be sectors of the economy that will have residual emissions. They'll still be emitting greenhouse gases in 2050. We also need removals because in most scenarios, we are going to have to go net negative in the second half of this century in order to bring greenhouse gases in the atmosphere down to safer levels. And just to give a bit of an idea of scale, in the UK, we're going to need a removals industry that can remove about the same amount of carbon, an equivalent amount of carbon each year as the annual emissions from the power sector today. So it's a pretty big industry that we need to create here in the UK. And we need to do that quite quickly. That's within a couple of decades that's going to have to go from pretty near zero today to that scale. And this will not just be in the UK, this is going to be global. And the UK is well placed economically and with the natural capital that we have to play a leading role in that growth if we're able to kind of grasp this opportunity and get the governance right. But we do need new governance. There are risks involved in carbon removal. And if we can't come up with good answers to questions like who gets to benefit from removals, in other words, who's allowed to keep emitting and get the benefit of those removals, and also who pays for it, then we will very likely miss net zero, and that will not be good for obvious reasons. Also, if we don't set kind of careful limits around the scale and location of some technologies, BECCS being an obvious example that gets a lot of attention, then we will likely cause environmental damage by accident, sure, but that's likely what's going to happen. Most removals rely in some way on land. Land is, of course, a finite resource. It's already under a huge amount of pressure. And the more demand we place on it, the more pressure we're going to be adding to ecosystems and the biodiversity crisis. So why not just leave this to the market? The whole point of markets, after all, is that they are good at efficiently allocating scarce resources. Unfortunately, in the case of GGRs, greenhouse gas removals, there's a number of features which means a pure market approach is likely to fail. And these derive from kind of classic causes of market failure, like public goods, like failure to price in externalities, lack of information, tragedy of the commons. So in practice, then, there's a number of challenges that we can highlight that will face GGR scale up, and the government really needs to grapple with these. I'll highlight 3 of them now. First, there is evidence that the availability of removal offsets discourages individuals, businesses, and even governments from reducing emissions as fast as they could. This is a problem because GGR capacity is limited. So if we don't reduce emissions enough because we think we're going to be able to offset them with GGRs in the future, we may not end up having enough GGR capacity to balance the resulting emissions in 2050 if we get locked into higher carbon business models and technologies thinking we'll be able to offset them. There are ways to avoid that, and we can look to voluntary schemes like the Science-Based Targets Initiative, which requires businesses to have a plan to reduce their emissions in line with climate science for their particular sector, and then only to use removal offsetting to balance off the emissions that they genuinely can't reduce. We're arguing that we need this kind of framework across the economy to decide which businesses and sectors are going to be allowed to have what level of emissions at different stages in the journey towards net zero. So we need to learn from this voluntary approach and move to applying that across the economy, particularly where carbon removals are being used to make carbon neutral net zero claims that then might impact on people's behavior. Once we've decided who gets to use carbon removal, i.e. who's allowed to have residual emissions, we also need to work out who's going to pay. And the obvious answer to that question is, well, the emitters should pay. But as we get closer to net zero, to 2050, it may not actually be that simple. And the reason is that different types of removal have really different prices. And to give a sense of this, even once engineered removals like BECCS and DACs, bioenergy, carbon capture and storage, and direct air carbon capture and storage have scaled up, they're still expected to be around 10 times more expensive than woodland carbon. Now, at the moment, large polluters like oil companies are buying up this cheaper woodland carbon, and they're buying it up kind of decades into the future because of obviously woodlands grow slowly and sequester carbon slowly. So they're locking up a lot of that cheaper carbon removal capacity. But by 2050, one of the sectors that's actually expected to have the largest residual emissions in a UK context is agriculture. Now, if the only greenhouse gas removals that we have left available at that stage are the engineered removals, because all those cheaper woodland removal capacity has already been bought, then we're left in a bit of a conundrum because agriculture as a sector does not have enough money to pay for engineered removals. So the public, in reality, are going to have to pick up that bill or we miss net zero. So we have to really grapple with these questions of allocating both the benefits and the costs now in order to avoid these kind of problems in the future. And finally, a pure market will optimize for the price of carbon and is likely to undervalue externalities like biodiversity. And in voluntary carbon markets, we do see that companies do take into account various different externalities. They want to be able to tell good stories about biodiversity, etc. But even where there are standards at a project level to make sure that that happens, that doesn't necessarily take into account the impact of multiple projects happening at scale. So you may have a case where you have many individual projects which each meet sustainability standards, but when you add them all up, the impact they have on the ecosystem as a whole is enormous and isn't being taken into account. So we need government to be more proactive in addressing these challenges. A new Office of Carbon Removal would set and oversee enforcement of a new set of rules and frameworks to address these and other risks that we outline in the report, and working with existing regulators and arm's length bodies to kind of do that enforcement. We think a new body is needed because the scale and pace that removals need to grow is quite staggering. And currently responsibility is split over a pretty mind-boggling web of government departments and government bodies, none of which, or very few of which, have an explicit remit just to look at greenhouse gas removals. It's often they're actually dealing with something else and it impacts on greenhouse gas removals. And this kind of fragmented approach probably isn't going to work very well for such a large and swift change. Removals also are pretty complicated and very varied and require kind of specific expertise and knowledge, and we need it needs to be governed by a body that has legitimacy across the 4 nations of the UK, because this isn't going to be something that's confined to each country. There's going to be trade, etc., across the borders. So that rules out many of our existing regulators, which we might have looked to take on some of these roles. So for us, this all points to a new body, an Office of Carbon Removal. The voluntary carbon markets, whilst they have done lots of good stuff, have shown us kind of time and again the things that can go wrong when you leave this kind of carbon trading up to unregulated markets. So this really feels like the right time for government to take a leading role in shaping the sector in the UK, and through this to show some global leadership on carbon removal. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Thanks for that overview. And obviously, I would encourage everyone to read the report after this webinar. We'll now hear from Donna and then from Steve with some initial remarks in response to Jim's presentation.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me here. So I'm Donna Rourke, and I am Head of ESG and Sustainability at BNP Paribas Real Estate. And I come at this from 2 angles. The first is on the commercial side of the business, where we are working with corporates, large and small, on their decarbonisation and their offsetting strategies. And then on the other side, we work with our rural clients through the business Stratton Parker, where we are really focusing quite heavily on woodland and peatland carbon codes. We work with that every day. So I bring those 2 perspectives. They're quite different. So on the whole, we wholeheartedly support this call to action about the Office for Carbon Removal that's been presented really comprehensively in the report. And I just have a few points, if I may. So firstly, as is alluded to throughout the report, I see every day that business really needs certainty. We have clients asking continually, what is net zero? What does it mean? What is carbon neutral? And how do we offset as part of that? And I think the first thing to get right, as Jim alluded to, is looking at something like the Science Based Targets Initiative example, so that everybody knows that net zero does not mean carbon neutral, and it does not mean that they don't need to decarbonise and they can just rely on offsetting. Similarly, we're continually asked what's offsetting, what's insetting, what's carbon removal, sequestration, for example. So just really clear, the basics need to be really clear. And we are seeing the impacts of all the problems that there are with the voluntary carbon market in terms of our clients are just so worried about greenwashing that they will not countenance the idea of entering into carbon removal projects, which obviously is meaning that there is carbon removal activities that we could be doing that aren't happening because of the reputation of the sector. So that's really where I think the benefit would be to business for this office is that certainty. And secondly, the statement of intent and the government showing that it was taking this seriously would bring investment, and that's what the investors are waiting for. They're there. We work closely with BNP Paribas Bank. The investors are there, and they just need that certainty in order to bring the money forward. The third point that I would make is on the Woodland Carbon Code and Peatland Carbon Code, which we work with continually. And I actually have a positive view of these. I think they've done a lot of good. They're good, solid frameworks. They do offer certainty. They're well monitored and well managed. So you know that if carbon is, if you have carbon credits in those under those codes, those carbon credits are legitimate. And I would just point out, I know there's a concern over agriculture, the agriculture sector not being able to offset its own emissions if everything that it has goes into commercial markets, for example. And I would say that on the ground, what's happening is any farm, any landowner, before they enter into any woodland or peatland carbon code agreement, they generally do calculate their own farm carbon requirements. So they will build their own offsetting into that strategy. So that's perhaps not as much of a problem as it might first appear. But we have the big question we ask ourselves, that we ask our clients, what happens in 30 years when those agreements come to an end? I think it's likely that timber will be a large part of it, and certainly most of the landowners we work with, that's their plan, is that there will be timber outputs from those projects. And there's a case there for arguing that timber is a sustainable building material and the carbon continues to be stored. So then my last point, and Jim picked up on that, this really needs to cover the 4 nations of the UK. And I would like to go further than that and say that this really needs to be part of a global collaboration. Firstly, we can really learn a lot of lessons from countries like Iceland, who are moving way ahead with this and have some similar geology to ourselves. Secondly, it gives more of that certainty. And thirdly, it enables the global multinational firms to be able to have certainty in their offsetting strategy too. So those are my points, but well done. It's a really comprehensive and fantastic report, and we fully support it.
Hello, everyone. I'm Steve Smith from the University of Oxford, and I'd like to start by thanking Jim and echoing what Donna said. I think this is a really good and timely report from the Green Alliance, and I really enjoyed reading it. I hope all of you watching do too as well. And I think there's a lot to be said for the recommendations in this, so I hope they get picked up and read and used. I guess from a science perspective and the perspective of my role in the core research project that Katerina mentioned, I'd just like to make a quick observation about the science of net zero, maybe picking up on Donna's point about the need for businesses to understand what net zero means, and then pick up on a couple of the conclusions and proposals of the report around who should get to buy removals, and also this idea of an office for greenhouse gas removal. So I think it's really important to be clear that net zero is a crucial and important target because it's a scientifically grounded target. So the concept of net zero actually comes from climate science. We know that if we want to stabilize global temperature rise at any level, be it 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees, 4 degrees, we have to eventually get to net zero CO2 emissions and deal with the other greenhouse gas emissions as well, such as methane and nitrous oxide. But for carbon dioxide, we know that its impact on the atmosphere, its impact on global temperature is essentially permanent. So for every unit of fossil CO2 we put into the atmosphere, that drives up temperature and holds temperature up for millions of years, or sorry, tens of thousands of years. So it's effectively permanent from the point of view of human beings. And that means that to the extent that we want to stabilize global temperature, we need to get those emissions down to zero of fossil CO2, or at least if we're putting any residual fossil CO2 into the atmosphere, that needs to be balanced out by removals. And that needs to be balanced out by similarly permanent removals if we actually want to stabilize global temperature. So I think that's a really crucial point, that net zero means a balance of sources and sinks, a balance of the amount of CO2 going into the atmosphere with the amount of CO2 coming out from human activities. And that points to this issue of durability of removals being really key, actually. The other point I'd just like to highlight, and I think is highlighted really well in the report Jim touched on, is that there's a huge diversity, huge variety of different ways we can remove CO2 from the atmosphere, from things that are very well known, like planting trees, restoring peatlands. A lot of the time we need to deal first with reducing emissions from deforestation and peatland degradation. But the more we do that and the more we build those back up and the more we go from chopping down trees to planting trees, we get into removals. But then there's also things like bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, of course, and there are many different ways to do that. But we can use the biomass in other ways. We can make biochar, where the carbon is locked up durably and maybe used in soils or in other applications. We have enhanced rock weathering, where we speed up the process of turning CO2 into minerals. And then, of course, we have things like direct air carbon capture and storage. So when we're talking about removals, we're talking about a lot of really different methods. And I think that's important when we get into the discussion about who gets to buy these things, what are they for, and so on. And I think this question of who gets to use the credit or buy removals is interesting, because the net zero pathways for the UK, as for instance, analysed by the Climate Change Committee, and globally as well, as analysed by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, for instance, show that we're going to need to be hugely ambitious on emissions reduction and hugely ambitious on greenhouse gas removal if we want to get to net zero on the timescales necessary. So there isn't really a lot of room for leeway, and there's not a lot of room for people claiming credit for large volumes of removals in place of emissions reductions. It's going to have to be both and. Now, in terms of determining who gets to pay, I think Jim touched on the importance of knowing what residual emissions will be. And I think I take a perhaps slightly different view, which is that I think we need to think about which removals can be counted as balancing which emissions. So currently in UK pathways, for instance, the CCC's pathways, residual emissions are predicted to come from largely a combination of aviation, flying, and agriculture. But and that's very strong analysis, very, very well grounded. But I think also we need to take a dose of humility and realize that history suggests we might be not very good at predicting what residual emissions might be. So I remember I'm old enough to have been involved in the CCC's analysis back in 2008, 2009. And I think there were a few things that came out of that analysis which were really strong and stood the test of time. The importance of decarbonising electricity generation fast and then electrifying other sectors. But if you look in the details of what was predicted, there was the suggestion that nuclear power was cheap, offshore wind was expensive, carbon capture and storage was on the way, insulating homes is a no-brainer. And of course, it still is a no-brainer, but of course we haven't done it. And all those other things have proved to be not quite so true. So I think we do need a bit of humility in predicting too far into the future what residual emissions will be. And I think also the companies that are buying high quality removals at the moment are not necessarily all from those those residual emitting sectors. So we see the likes of Microsoft and Stripe, these tech companies, which should be able to decarbonize fast and are making efforts to do so, that are the ones really pushing forward and financing these high quality, particularly more technological and durable removals in the absence currently of government support. So I'm perhaps less worried than this Green Alliance report is about predicting what residual emissions are, but I am worried about getting the right balance. And by that, I mean, I think it's key that fossil carbon emissions need to be balanced out by similarly permanent removals. And the issue we have, of course, at the moment, particularly in the voluntary carbon markets, is that there's a whole menagerie of different credits from emissions reduction, emissions avoidance, and removals projects. And they are all used as in a one-to-one sort of accounting balance against emissions at the moment. But what we need to be doing is making sure we get to a durable net zero, where fossil carbon is balanced by permanent removals, and broadly, land emissions can be balanced by land-based removals. And then just finally, on this point about the Office for Greenhouse Gas Removal, I think it's a really interesting idea. Of course, many of you will be aware that the government has published its net zero strategy, and that contains some elements of the plan for greenhouse gas removal. Notably, there are targets for tree planting rates, for peatland restoration, and for 5 million tonnes of engineered greenhouse gas removal by 2030. And there are some commitments in there as well to develop monitoring, reporting and verification standards, and also some kind of business model for engineered removals, some kind of way of providing finance and support to make those things deployable. I think what's largely lacking is putting those things in place. So government has consulted on the business models, but we've yet to see what they are, and a detailed timeline of how to get there. And of course, delivering 5 million tonnes by 2030, and then the steep rise that comes very quickly after 2030, if you look carefully in those pathways, means I think we need a really clear plan. And as Jim alluded to, this really requires cross-departmental thinking, because it requires thinking about what we're going to use our land and biomass for, what we're going to do on CO2 transport and storage infrastructures, what we're going to do about making sure these things meet the environmental standards we have. So I think there is a role for cross-departmental thinking, but what I would be keen to ensure is that rather than ghettoizing greenhouse gas removals, we mainstream them. And by that, I mean, I think that when government departments are thinking about these elements that are part of the diverse systems we need for removals as well as emissions reductions, because a lot of them are common to both, we make sure that removals is in the thinking. So when we're considering building our CO2 transport and storage infrastructure, we consider where that might be useful for removals, not just capturing from point source emissions. When we're considering pyrolysis units for biochar, we make sure that those stick to the environmental permitting procedures we have for air quality, for instance. And those, I think, should be the ones that we have that are common for all activities and not necessarily just GGR specific. So I'm very keen that we mainstream thinking of removals into lots of different government and business activities, and we right size it, and we make sure that we're having like for like balances and a durable net zero. But I think within that context, there are a lot of really, really good recommendations, and thanks to Green Alliance for this report.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you, Donna, for your remarks. We are now going to move on to have a bit of a discussion around some of these points. And I'd like to start actually by picking up on some of the one point that actually Donna made around business needing certainty, and particularly around concerns around greenwashing and wanting to sort of ensure credibility if they purchase in voluntary carbon markets. Could you expand perhaps on what you see the role for government in providing some of that certainty? And how should they go about highlighting what can qualify as offsets, when businesses cannot use those offsets, and perhaps also address the point that Steve made around making sure that if there is fossil carbon being put into the atmosphere, that is balanced by permanent carbon removals.
Hi there, I'm really sorry, my internet dropped out, so I actually didn't hear that question. If you could just repeat it.
Yeah, I was asking about sort of if you can expand on your point around businesses needing certainty, and in what way would you want government to sort of provide some of that certainty?
So the main point is just the long-term vision of the government. So where do they want to be by 2050? How much carbon removal do they want to have at that time? What investments are they going to put in place to ensure that that will happen? And then if we come right into the short term, the main certainty that they need is, what does net zero mean? Does it mean carbon neutral, or does it mean net zero? What we're finding is that our different sectors are developing their own methodology at the moment. So in real estate, it is the UK Green Building Council has their own view of what net zero is, and they include both embodied carbon and other carbon in that. Other parts of the sector, so the land sector, for example, would not include embodied carbon, they just include in-use carbon. So that, for me, that's the first thing that needs to be answered, because then everybody knows where they're trying to get to.
Can I just pick up on sort of the point around near-term certainty and clarity around where can businesses actually rely on offsets? Would you want to be that to be seen as a mandatory set of standards that government enforces? Is that an enforcement around the business claims, as opposed to who can actually access some of those credits? Yeah.
I would say yes, and I would say that will be the only way that it would happen. But everything that I know about the real estate and land sector is that legislation drives everything. And I will use the minimum energy efficiency standards regulations as an example. They are far from perfect, but what they do is they set some definite markers that we have to get to. So we have to get all buildings to an EPC B by 2030, and so that gives a deadline and an action that needs to be done, and that's the kind of certainty that the sector responds to.
Thank you. And Steve, picking up on your point, in fact, around sort of making sure that we define what kind of emissions can be balanced by particular types of carbon removals. So how would you go about ensuring that if there is fossil carbon being put into the atmosphere, that it's permanent carbon storage and removal and storage that is being invested in by those companies? Because I think, like, obviously you mentioned the likes of Stripes and Microsoft, they're investing in engineered removals, but in many cases instead, many companies, including many of the oil majors, will be investing and buying in bulk tree planting credits. So how would you go about operationalizing that step?
Well, I think so a lot of the most permanent methods are the ones that involve geological storage or some kind of mineralization of the CO2. And that's by no means to say that other methods, planting trees, restoring habitats and so on, are worthless. They come with a huge amount of co-benefits, and so I think there's an awful lot of reasons to do that, as well as their capacity to balance out maybe where we're losing carbon from land systems, and getting that to net zero. But I think, I mean, it could be as basic as an informational point. It could be that, you know, when the government creates its net zero strategies, it's making sure that within that you're not achieving a net zero by 2050 in which you are offsetting, you have a lot of residual fossil carbon being used, you know, and net zero being met in 2050 by balancing that out with a lot of tree planting. And of course, once you sort of get into the details of that, you realize that actually there's not going to be a huge amount of wiggle room for still using much fossil fuels, because it's going to be a pretty vertiginous scale up of BECCS and DACs and other methods just to get to the level that's in current CCC and government pathways. So I think all reasonable paths to net zero involve a big come down in fossil fuel use. But I think one way is just to acknowledge that point and make sure that pathways stack up in terms of what you might call a geological net zero or a kind of durable net zero. Government could go further, and in setting the sorts of standards and regulations around net zero claims that have been discussed earlier, they could say that, well, if you want to be genuine net zero, it must be stronger than just the sort of net zero of balancing emissions with removals in any given year, but is this similar sort of durable net zero. And of course, the costs of doing the durable net zero, as Jim mentioned, are high. So currently, there are real direct air capture projects out there. There are real BECCS projects out there, and people are buying credits. So, I mean, we talked a lot about offsets and voluntary markets, and I think it's important to say that's not the only way of scaling up removals. It's definitely the way that's being used at the moment, largely in the absence of government regulations. But I think some of these issues we need to kind of pass between what are issues with the voluntary carbon markets in general and what are specific to removals. But certainly for the voluntary carbon credits that are being traded in these high quality removals, we're talking about at the least sort of £100 a tonne for biochar, going up to people paying well over $1,000 a tonne at the moment for direct air capture. So this stuff is not cheap at the moment.
Thank you. And Jim, if you can pick up on this point as well, could you expand perhaps on how you would see the Office for Carbon Removal addressing different investment with different businesses in the whole portfolio of greenhouse gas removals, including making sure that while we might want fossil carbon to be balanced by permanent geological carbon store, we can still facilitate financial flows going towards peatland restoration and afforestation without undermining mitigation efforts?
Yeah, so this is a really key question. I think the point we're kind of trying to make is, well, some of this stuff still needs to be worked out, right? So we don't necessarily have all the answers to all of these questions, but we can look and kind of say at this stage what some good uses seem like and what some not so good uses look like. Steve set out really well this kind of difference between kind of sequestration in trees and vegetation or soils versus kind of properly permanent sequestration in geological stores or through mineralization. And that's really important. That's one of the points we make in the report, is we definitely shouldn't be considering woodland carbon sequestration as a permanent offsetting of a fossil fuel emission, because that's clearly not going to work. So an Office for Carbon Removal could set some rules and frameworks around those kind of things, around how you can use different types of removal and what claims you can make as a result of that, depending on what your emissions look like and what claims you're making. And so to the voluntary carbon markets, I think one of the interesting things that seems to have been emerging in the last few years is, and I came across this working on doing some work on soil carbon. Soil carbon is really tricky because it's even more so than woodland carbon. We really don't have very much good idea about actually what's happening with carbon flows in soil. It can change from year to year, very difficult to measure in practice, but we also do know, broadly speaking, some good things to do in terms of soil management that are good for lots of other things, and also probably sequester some carbon. So what's happening in some of those is that companies are coming along and saying, okay, we'll pay for some of these activities because they're really good things to do, and we'll do a bit of carbon monitoring as well, see if there's a bit of carbon, we get a certificate or whatever. They're not using that as an offset to then claim, oh, we're carbon neutral or we're net zero. They're just doing it as an investment in a good environmental thing, and that's kind of like good, all to the good from both a kind of climate and nature perspective. So there are different ways that companies can invest, different claims that they can make. What we need is more clarity around what the appropriate things are in different circumstances, and that, I think, is an important role that an Office for Carbon Removal could play.
Thank you, Jim. We're going to come to questions from the audience in a minute, so please do post your questions in the Q&A function. I'm going to ask Jim for one more follow-up questions, particularly around the potential impact of greenhouse gas removals on wider sustainability aspects, and in particular, how you see the scale-up of carbon removals, for example, in the UK, sort of having an impact potentially on other priorities such as food security, and how should government go about addressing some of those competing priorities, perhaps?
Yeah, so this is obviously, like as I said in my talk at the beginning, really kind of fundamental to our thinking around scale up of GGRs. As I said, most of the greenhouse gas removal technologies that we currently are thinking about, with the exception of direct air carbon capture and storage have some kind of land footprint. And we are already in a situation where really we, from a biodiversity perspective, and most of my work at Green Alliance is actually on land use and the natural environment, we are already using too much land, and that's what's driving for kind of human purposes, mostly agriculture, and that is what's driving the biodiversity crisis. So adding, and if you look at some of the predictions in scenarios where that basically take all of the GGR, the greenhouse gas removal that we think we're going to need, and basically make it into BECCS, which some of the kind of, that's how some of the accounting in kind of global assessment models has worked in the past. And then if you work out how much land that involves in terms of creating that amount of biomass, it's enormous. It could be kind of like 50% of the current agricultural land use in addition to what we already do, sort of thing. So we just don't have that kind of land to play with. So we really have to kind of find ways to deal with that. The approach we've taken at Green Alliance is to say we need to meet net zero in the UK domestically with the resources that we have here in the UK, and find ways to do that. That feels like the safest and fairest way to do it. I know there are other approaches. The CCC kind of takes a look at the global availability of biomass and says kind of like, what's the fair share of global biomass that the UK should be able to use globally. That's another way, because of the problems that there have been in the past with international trading of carbon credits, etc., under UN schemes. We've taken the view, net zero, if we want to be safe about it in a UK context, the UK target, we just have to do it here with what we have and make it work.
Thank you, Jim. A question now for picking up from some questions from the audience. A question from Steve and then for Donna around whether there are lessons from other countries that the UK could learn in terms of their current approach to greenhouse gas removal. And in particular to Donna, if you can please expand on Iceland's regulatory environment of carbon removals. But Steve, I'll come to you first.
Sure. I think we're at a relatively early stage of any country thinking about greenhouse gas removal, or certainly framed in that way. I mean, arguably forestry policy is something that's lived on longer. But I guess if we focus a bit more on the kind of novel or engineered removal methods, the UK is towards the front of a relatively small pack. But I'd say that's changing fast, and there's a lot of scope for other countries to leap ahead pretty quickly given that position. One country that, of course, a lot of people are talking about is the US, because with the Inflation Reduction Act, that includes, alongside lots of money for lots of low carbon things, it includes a tax credit for geological carbon storage, including from BECCS and DACS plants. So I think we're seeing a lot of interest in that. But the US is by no means the only country. So the UK, as I mentioned, has said it's minded to create a business model for engineered removals, and it has its target of 5 million tons. And the kind of proposed model that I think they were expressing as their preferred one in the consultation, but consulting on, was something similar to the contracts for difference we've seen work relatively well for renewables in the UK. The European Commission is leading first with a carbon removal certification scheme. So it's saying first we want to get the framework right around what counts as a carbon removal and how we monitor and verify that. We're seeing reverse auctions for BECCS in Sweden, where of course they have quite a large developed forestry industry, and they already use quite a lot of forestry waste for combined heat and power. So I think we're actually in a really interesting position where it's a bit like a kind of living experiment. We're seeing lots of different interventions in different countries. And, you know, as a researcher and an academic, I think it's just going to be really interesting to see how they pan out and what we can learn over the coming few years.
Thank you, Steve. Donna, do you want to come in on the point around Iceland?
My pleasure. So Iceland's really unusual because it's geothermal energy, which means that it can really power the carbon capture plants without creating more emissions, and also the geology that it has, so which really enables it to store that carbon. something that it has that is similar to the UK is that it is a small island nation, but the difference there is that there's real accessibility between the kind of tech, the pioneers of the people developing the carbon capture technologies, and with the policymakers and government in Iceland. There's a really close relationship, and it's that has made it possible. So the government really is focused on providing an environment for success. So they provide investment, they give tax relief, they just really try to be agile. So the main success story in Iceland is a company called Climeworks, and they will say that a lot of their success is down to the hospitality of the Icelandic government and the way that they made it possible. Whatever they needed, they were given. And I think it's a really interesting case study, actually. So this project is able to take 36,000 tons of CO2 out of the air every year. It diverts it down into the rock, and over a few years, this becomes a permanent removal. And something that I thought was a really interesting point, just picking up on a couple of people have talked about the high cost of these carbon credits. Stripe has agreed to buy a lot of these credits at a cost of $775 per unit, which is huge. So yeah, that's what's happening in Iceland. It's really about that flexibility and agility and support from government for the project.
Thank you. Picking up then on a couple of other themes that are emerging from the audience questions. So one is around the recommended sort of mix of engineered versus nature-based greenhouse gas removals in the Climate Change Committee advice. I wonder whether there's any of the panelists that want to comment on whether the current balance perhaps is too skewed in favor of engineered removals. This is one of the sort of emerging themes from audience questions. And the other question that is perhaps more to do with the report and how the Office of Carbon Removal would operate, and it's around how it would ensure also sort of that plans around greenhouse gas removal deployment are aligned with broader emission reduction efforts, and sort of more generally also how it aligns with the CCC recommendations of this. Can I maybe come to Steve on the mix of greenhouse gas removals? And then if Jim, you want to also touch on that point and comment on how the OCR would interact with with the CCC.
Yeah, I'm kind of interested to hear more from Jim, actually. I know there are a few differences between the CCC scenario and Green Alliances, and I think kind of I'd like to hear more. I think they're interesting to discuss. I mean, broadly, I think one consideration from a scientific point of view is actually that the uncertainty margins actually on what we can measure on land are still pretty large, and especially, Jim, you mentioned this, when it comes to peatlands, they've only emissions from peatlands have only recently been added to the UK inventory. It's been a kind of frontier science effort, and it's added a large amount onto the UK's emissions inventory because we have relatively large amounts of peat that are all pretty degraded areas of the fens that have been converted into, a very fertile soil for growing salad vegetables and the like. So they've been drained for that. But the error bars are large, and I think that means that there's quite a lot of uncertainty on how much emissions reduction and removal you can get on these, even though the kind of direction of travel is clear that you want to sort of restore these things. So while the interventions can be pretty clear sometimes, the exact bang for your buck you might get by 2050 can be somewhat less clear. I don't think that diminishes agreement on the fact that they're worthwhile doing, but it can kind of affect the numbers quite a lot. Then when it comes to whether there should be a sort of prescriptive balance in general between so-called land or nature-based removals and so-called novel or engineered, I don't really know the answer. I think it's really important to have a portfolio of technologies, because actually partly by having a portfolio, you can concentrate your co-benefits where you get them, but you also reduce over-reliance, and this kind of massive quantity of BECCS in some of the global pathways is clearly unsustainable in some scenarios that have been looked at. Partly that has just been a failure of imagination of the number of options in these models. A lot of them only had 2 options. They had, you can plant more trees or you can do BECCS. And in order to meet a really stringent target like 1.5 degrees, of course, the models absolutely gobbled up any removals it could do. And so if you don't have great constraints on your biomass, and you only have 2 removal options, you get all the biomass possible going into BECCS inside the model. Now, clearly that's not necessarily what we actually want to do as a real world. And I think pushing a portfolio measures across land and engineered means we're less reliant on any individual one. And there are some methods such as biochar and enhanced weathering that are not actually in the CCC scenarios. So I think, again, there's probably an important point about continued innovation and R&D to bring forward some new methods, because I think there's still a lot of scope for innovation in this space.
Yeah, definitely agree with that. Yeah, no, I think on the peatland point, I think we probably have a better understanding of the emissions that are coming from peat, because we can actually go out and try and measure them. What's less certain is what happens once you've restored the peat, because we've had less time to kind of study that, particularly when you are getting back towards kind of naturally functioning peat. How much is it actually a net sequestering, and how significant is that? We've got quite wildly different numbers on that in some studies, but definitely things that we need to do, and certainly from an emissions reduction perspective, that has to happen. In terms of Green Alliance's work, so we've produced some kind of land use scenarios that started from the perspective of how do we meet net zero across the economy. What does land use need to look like in order to do that? We took the CCC's scenarios as our base for that in terms of all the other emissions that are happening elsewhere in the economy, and then looked at how you can basically flex between different types of GGRs in order to get to net zero. And because we were looking at land use, we're also flexing how much emissions come from land and agriculture in that. So that's what we were looking at there. The preferred scenario we came up with had quite a bit more habitat restorations, more natural carbon sequestration than are in the CCC scenarios. That's also very good from a perspective of restoring nature, which is another of obviously the targets in the UK. In terms of interactions more broadly then between like what would an Office of Carbon Removal be doing and what would other bodies like the CCC be doing, I think one of the real benefits would be to have an expert body that's looking specifically at GGR. Then we can start to feed some of this more detailed information and understanding and analysis into the recommendations that the CCC is then making to the government on what kind of pathways need to be pursued. The CCC is obviously like a brilliant body and globally recognized as a really great function that was created by the Climate Change Act. It has limited resources, and GGR is a massive thing in and of itself. So being able to feed in, have a body that's got more resource to feed in better data, better information into the CCC to then advise the government on pathways, I think would be really useful. And we'll start to see some of those other things come through that Steve mentioned, other GGR options and where they might fit in, what their appropriate role might be.
Thank you. We have time for another couple of questions. So I think one is around how development of GGR, in particular sort of the role of the Office of Carbon Removal, will look to also coordinate with government plans around the development of CCS. So this, I guess, I'll ask Jim if you want to comment on that. And then there's another question around sort of how can we deal with different capacities in different sort of industries, activities, and countries around effective MRV. And I'll ask perhaps if Steve wants to come in, but then I will also ask perhaps Don if you want to provide some, in front of you, if you come in your next sort of remarks, if you want to just provide some very brief concluding remarks on this topic, and we will wrap up shortly.
Was it me first, Katharina? Yeah. Yeah, so in terms of interactions, as I think we've already kind of discussed, greenhouse gas removals, from an accounting perspective, we feel it's really important to have a kind of glass wall between removals and reductions, because we don't think we can treat greenhouse gas removals as infinitely able to just offset emissions. And if we do, we're very likely to overshoot net zero. So we have to have this kind of like glass wall between removals and reductions to make sure that we're still doing all the reduction stuff that we need to do. So then in terms of interactions, greenhouse gas removals, as has kind of been discussed, the different technologies sit across a really wide array of other businesses and technologies that are all regulated and overseen in different ways. This is why we have this really kind of complicated governance picture already. So those kind of things are going to have to keep going on. So for example, if we're doing geological storage, there's clearly going to be a role for a body like the Oil and Gas Authority, for example, as an expert body in how to make sure that that is happening in a kind of safe and stable way. So the Office of Carbon Removal would really have to work with, as I said, with all these existing kind of regulators and bodies to make sure that there's alignment on all of that stuff. But we do think there needs to be a focus on the act of removing and storing carbon as a thing in and of itself. And then obviously there'll be lots of other interactions with that. And again, on the nature-based side, on woodland, etc., you know, there's lots of regulation around forestry, etc., that will still need to be applied. But so then there'll be information that will need to be fed in from, for example, the Forestry Commission into an Office of Carbon Removal, which at the moment is perhaps getting a bit lost, because the Forestry Commission isn't principally concerned with carbon removal, it's principally concerned with forestry.
Great, thank you. Steve, if you actually want to just provide sort of a 1 minute sort of concluding sort of statement, perhaps actually highlighting what is your one key takeaway from the report that you would like the audience to also focus on.
Well, that's a challenge. I mean, I really welcome the report, because I think, yes, it's pretty clear that if we want a decent shot of getting to net zero in the UK and internationally, then we need to be looking at removals much more alongside redoubling our efforts on emissions reductions. So I think this is very timely, and I think there's a clear role for government in building confidence and actually helping with effective and sustainable delivery of this stuff. So I think whether that's delivered through a single office of greenhouse gas removal or whether it's something similar, I think is a really interesting discussion that I look forward to taking forward. I definitely think it's good food for thought. So yeah, thanks to Jim and the team for putting the report together.
Thank you, Steve. And Donna, final remark from you.
Sure. So I'd like to echo Steve and say that we really welcome this report too. It's really comprehensive. And I'd like to also follow Jim's point, which is that really reduction is the first thing that we need to focus on, and this cannot take the place of that. And then we need the certainty of an end goal and the support for the development of technology. And bringing in Steve's point here, that needs to encompass a wide range of nature-based and engineering-based solutions. And then something that we probably haven't touched on here, but it's really important, is we do need a framework for sensible access for people to be able to buy and sell these carbon credits. And then I'd like to just finish off by saying that I am very much looking forward to seeing the government's response.
Thank you. And now all that remains for me is to thank the panelists. Thanks for a great discussion and all your insights. Congratulations again to Green Alliance for this new report. And thank you to all the audience members for coming along and for interacting and for all your questions. This recording will be available on the Green Alliance website, and I would obviously encourage everyone to also go and read the report. Thank you very much and have a wonderful rest of the day.